All right, this is another part of our What I Love About Comics video series. We're here today with special guest Eric C. Jones. He's an employee here at Four Color Fantasies. So, Eric, tell us what you love about comics.
What I love about comics. There are a lot of things I love about comics, but the first thing that came to mind is Vertigo comics. Specifically the 90s stuff, but I really like any Vertigo stuff. And the reason I like Vertigo is it's a cliche nowadays, but when I first got into Vertigo, it was the first time I thought that comics weren't just for kids. And Vertigo puts out what anybody that's ever talked to me knows. Preacher is my favorite comic of all time, and it's a story about a preacher who has lost his faith, and it's his search for God and whether or not God is a good person or abstract being, and it's him and his hitman girlfriend and his drinking Irish vampire best friend, and they travel the world, and it's incredibly violent and very offensive and not a comic for everyone, but it's my favorite. Vertigo did things like Transmetropolitan, which is sci-fi political, like Hunter S. Thompson in the future, and it came out in the late '90s, but it ties in, it mirrors modern politics pretty closely. But Vertigo kind of started out with taking DC heroes and making them more mature titles. Like Swamp Thing was one of the first Vertigo books, and Swamp Thing used to just be generic kind of muck monster from the swamp, and it became something much bigger and with uh, more dealing with the earth and the planet and religion and what it means to be human and love, and just a very deep book. It also took, I'm trying to think what else. Animal Man. Animal Man was kind of just a generic hero who had the powers of an animal, and then Grant Morrison got a hold of it, and it became about Earth preservation and animal rights. And it was very meta, and there was an issue where Animal Man met Grant Morrison, and the writer became a part of it and changed the history of the book. And what else did they do? They did House of Mystery and House of Secrets, and turned those, which were kind of old school DC horror books, and flipped them on their head and made them into modern twists on horror stuff. They did these great anthologies, like they modernized Weird War Tales, which used to be an old DC anthology book, but made it a 4-issue mini, which was very dark horror, and Gangland, which was all crime stuff, and Strange Adventures, which was all sci-fi stuff. They did Flinch, which was an ongoing horror anthology book, and they introduced a lot of European artists to the American audience that maybe they weren't as popular here before. Guys like Garth Ennis, Steve Dillon, Grant Morrison, Jamie Delano. Alan Moore was already established, but he kind of helped bring in Vertigo. Neil Gaiman, who did Sandman, which is one of the most popular comics of all time, and one of the only comic to ever win one of the literary awards that I can't think of right now. But Sandman was Newberry. Thank you. What Bowen said. Sandman started out as a horror book, and it was the physical embodiment of dreams, and he was captured, and then he escaped and had to get back his mystical items and totems. But then it quickly became everything and anything, and it was Neil Gaiman. If he wanted to write a story about Midsummer Night's Dream, he could do an issue about that. He did an issue about Arabian mythology. He could do an issue about transgender rights, and it was all within the circle of Sandman. And again, one of the first very mainstream mature titles. Let me see. I made notes because I can't remember, like Mike does, everything he's ever written. 100 Bullets was an awesome crime book by Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Riso, and it started out as a guy would show up, and if somebody's life had been completely screwed up, he'd show up and give him a briefcase with a gun and 100 bullets and a motorcycle, and 100 bullets and info, and say, this is who screwed up your life. Here's an unmarked gun, 100 bullets. You can shoot someone in front of cops and you'll get away with it. And it went from there and became the whole thing about conspiracies running the United States. Why the Last Man by Brian K. Vaughan was every man on Earth dies except for one guy named Yorick and his pet monkey. And then it's him just traveling the United States and what would happen to the world if every single man died. And it went to some very strange places, very dark places, but really kind of one of Brian K. Vaughan's first big books. What else do I got written down here? Again, I love Vertigo miniseries. Pride and Joy was a Garth Ennis book, which was a crime book where it was a reformed mafia hitman who got out of it, and then this twisted guy from his past came back and just kind of screwed everything up for him and drug him back into life. Terminal City is one of my all-time favorite books from Vertigo, and it's one that not a lot of people know about, and it's just like a 1930s kind of era book with some sci-fi stuff, like people riding around in dirigibles, and it's a mix of like kind of Art Deco sci-fi and a little bit of criminal underbelly kind of stuff, and just a really interesting book. But again, one people don't talk about. Newer Vertigo stuff that is, they're still putting out books that are excellent. A couple years ago, you had Sweet Tooth, which put Jeff Lemire on the map, which was post-apocalyptic. Something happened, and these mutant children were born with like animal features. And this kid Gus, who's got deer antlers, has been living in the woods with his dad his whole life, knows nothing outside of the woods and his dad, and then one day meets another human, and then it turns out that the mutant children are being hunted down, and they might be the cause of the apocalypse. And so it's Gus's quest to kind of figure out what has happened to the Earth and if it's his fault and if there's anything they can do about it. Coffin Hill was a horror book of recent years, which was a girl who's descended from a line of witches, and then she became a police officer in Boston and helped solve this murder that nobody else could solve. And then she solved it, but then she became kind of blacklisted by the cops because of who she was. And then it delved more into her history and how the town she grew up in, Coffin Hill, is really twisted and messed up. I say twisted a lot for Vertigo, but it's not. They don't do a lot of all ages books. What else? Check my notes again. Fables, of course, Fables. Fables is one of the best comics of all time. It is every fable and fairy tale you've ever heard of, and they used to all live in one world, and then somebody called the Adversary drove them all out and was killing them off. So they escaped to our world, and they live in a building in New York City, and are trying to live a normal life, but are, once they came to this side, all past crimes have been forgotten. So the big bad wolf is the sheriff. Prince Charming is kind of the second in command of the mayor, who is Old King Cole. Snow White is the maybe head of office. All the wicked witches keep the magic going to kind of keep them hidden from the world. And it's just, it was 60, 70 some issues, maybe more, I could be wrong. And it was just fantastic. Pretty much all done by Bill Willingham and Mark Buckingham. Tremendous book. It's one of those comics that everyone should read. They took old DC heroes and kind of put them in a modern twist. Jonah Hex. There was 3 minis of Jonah Hex through Vertigo that were really weird West stuff. Like I love Jonah Hex anyway, but they took it and kind of made it. Joe Lansdale wrote them with Timothy Truman, who Mike will tell you all about, and they were just weird, dark Western things that were not your bright, sunny Westerns that you're used to. And one of them went in like almost a Lovecraftian kind of way. Hellblazer. There you go. That's another one. Hellblazer was a character that spun out of Swamp Thing. John Constantine. He's a magician, but he's not like an Alakazam magician. And he's kind of a jerk. And he can do magic, but he will screw his friends over to keep himself on top. And there's a famous storyline from Garth Ennis where John gets cancer because he smokes like a chimney. And he tricks the devil into getting rid of his cancer, but screws over a lot of people in the process. Again, just a super cool book. Another newer book, American Vampire, which put Scott Snyder on the scene. And it's just a different take on vampires where there are certain different clans of vampires. There's the classic European vampire, but then there's a newer American vampire who can go in the sun. But when different things can hurt different vampires. And just it went from the Wild West up until the space race kind of era of America. And just did, again, kind of took the vampire thing and turned it on its head, which Vertigo is known for, is kind of taking something you might know and changing it a little bit. Astro City is now put out through Vertigo, which is a classic superhero kind of style of book. It's been through a bunch of different companies, but now it's found its home at Vertigo. And again, it's almost Silver Age, but still modern sensibilities. And it's when you first read Astro City, you think, oh, well, I've seen these characters before. But after you finish one issue, you're like, well, this is actually like nothing I've ever read before. And I think that is I mean, there's so many. I honestly, that's it. But there's so many Vertigo books. Like they're as Image is kind of seen now. That was Vertigo for years. They would put out books that nobody else would put out. Like in the '90s, nobody did anything like Vertigo, and there are still books that Vertigo's putting out that aren't like anything you've ever read. And if you're maybe tired of other things like superheroes or the usual kind of stuff, I think Vertigo's a great way to try some new things in comics. And as much as I've rambled, that is what I love about comics.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us.